Imagine a dragon's head emerging from a tree line, not from the water, from the forest, miles from any coast, miles from any river wide enough to float a leaf, and yet there it is. The carved snarl of oak, the iron rivets catching the pale morning light, the hull scraping through mud and pine needle and the crushed bones of last autumn's leaves. You blink. You look again. It is still there. What if I told you that the Vikings' greatest weapon was as deadly on grass as it was on the waves? At first glance, it looks like a hallucination. But step closer, because the truth is stranger and far more terrifying than the myth. Chapter 1. The engineering. The axe wasn't their most terrifying tool. It was the ship, and the terrifying reality that even if you lived 50 miles inland, you weren't safe. I will reveal to you a secret that changes everything about how we see the Norse warrior. We have spent centuries imagining the Viking longship as a creature of the sea. Salt spray, open horizons, the crash of waves against a foreign shore, and, yes, it was all of that. But the engineers who built these vessels were solving a problem that had nothing to do with ocean crossings. They were solving the problem of land. The longship was built using a technique called clinker construction. Overlapping planks, each one riveted to the next like fish scales on a living body. The hull did not fight the water. It moved with it. It flexed. Where a rigid vessel would crack under pressure, the longship absorbed it, distributed it, survived it. The keel, that long, low spine running the length of the hull, functioned like a tightrope walker's pole. It provided just enough lateral resistance to keep the vessel tracking straight, without adding the weight that would have made the whole enterprise impossible. The result was a ship that sat, in some cases, less than a meter below the waterline, less than a meter. That is shallower than smarter than half the stuff in your modern marina. Purpose-built for rivers, for estuaries, for beaches where no port existed. This wasn't just a boat, it was a weapon, and like all great weapons, its genius was in what it could do that nothing else could. It could walk. Chapter 2. The Portage Ritual, and here is the kicker. When the water ran out, the Vikings didn't stop. They picked the ship up and kept moving. The process was called portage, and I want you to feel it, not just understand it. You are standing in mud to your ankles. The air smells of pine tar and river clay, and the sharp sweat of 40 men who have not slept enough. The ship has been unloaded, every barrel, every bundle of furs, every weapon and water skin pulled, out and stacked on the bank. The hull, stripped bare, rides higher now, still enormous, still an object of almost absurd ambition. Rollers are cut from the nearest trees, logs smoothed and greased, animal fat, pine resin, whatever was available, laid in a track ahead of the bull. Ropes are rigged, and then the crew begins to pull. You have, at some point in your life, assembled flat-pack furniture and felt the specific humiliation of a diagram that makes no sense, a screw that strips at the last turn, the quiet rage of a grown adult defeated by pressed wood. The Viking portage crew felt none of that. There was no confusion. Every man knew his load, his rope, his position. The rhythm was mechanical, almost musical. The groan of wood on wood, the bark of a single voice calling the pull. And then, the unified answer of 40 bodies leaning into it at once. Using our modern visualizing tools, we can reconstruct these lost moments with conceptual simulations that bridge the gap between archaeology and reality. What those reconstructions show is not chaos. They show something closer to a military drill. Competence worn so deep it had become instinct. It wasn't luck. It was by design. The answer to this question lies not in brute strength alone, but in the architecture of a crew that had trained its coordination the same way it had trained its sword arm, relentlessly, and with consequence for failure. Chapter 3. Strategic shock now. Consider what this meant for the people on the other side of those hills. The Varangian route, the great Norse pathway from Scandinavia down through the river systems of Eastern Europe to Byzantium, crossed dozens of portages. The Dnieper alone demanded it multiple times. And yet Norse traders, warriors, and mercenaries moved along it with a regularity that stunned the civilizations they encountered. Constantinople did not expect visitors to arrive having carried their ships across 500 miles of steppe. We think of invasion corridors as fixed geography, coastlines, river mouths, mountain passes. The Vikings redrew that map. Every river became an artery, every watershed became a doorway. The portage was the key that opened the interior of an entire continent. Safe inland was an illusion. The monastery on the hill, the village a day's march. From the nearest navigable water, the fortress built with its back to the forest, none of it was protection, because the ships could come through the trees. Chapter 4. The Warrior Identity. This is what we miss when we reduce the Viking to an image of violence and nothing more. The portage was not a feat of rage, it was a feat of organization, of discipline, of collective nerve held steady over days of brutal physical labor in hostile territory, with everything the crew owned either on their backs or balanced on pine grease rollers under 40 tons of oak. What emerges from that mud is not just a warrior, it is a system, human, wooden, ancient, and terrifyingly effective. The dragon head on the water was a warning. The dragon head rising from the forest behind your village was something else entirely. So I leave you with this question. What is more intimidating to you? The dragon head on the horizon, or the reality that a fleet could suddenly emerge from the forest behind your home?